Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on our webinar today, looking at cybersecurity monitoring and metrics. We will be looking at the question that you can't manage what you can't measure continuously, and think about how monitoring and metrics all play a role in cybersecurity. For the webinar today, we are using the GoToWebinar application. And so as we go through this presentation, if you do have questions on any of the topics or any areas where you want to ask questions and go deeper, please do use the question tool. And I should have about 15 minutes to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Before jumping into the content, I like to do just a very brief introduction on myself. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and I am a safety and cybersecurity engineer at Exida. My background is in chemical engineering, and so I started out really more on HAZOPs and safety risk assessments, but over time, I naturally transitioned to look at cybersecurity as well, and I've worked on everything from cybersecurity risk assessments really all the way through implementation of cybersecurity countermeasures and the full life cycle approach. Some brief background on Exida: we really are a customer-focused company, and we work with our customers to achieve safe, reliable, and secure solutions through a number of different ways. The first way is our enterprise tools. And so that is often Excellentia on the safety and cybersecurity side for end users. And really the goal is to develop that lifecycle approach efficiently and really get effective and correct results every time. We also have a certification and assessment division that provides certification to functional safety and cybersecurity standards for equipment, as well as systems and even for sites sometimes. And then lastly, we have comprehensive lifecycle services, um, which is what I'll be speaking about today, or really where I work. And we'll be thinking, in that area about how we can solve industry's toughest problems for safety concerns, as well as cybersecurity and alarm management. For our webinar today, what we'll be looking at and really focusing in on is this idea of cybersecurity monitoring and metrics. And so the first thing we'll talk about is really trying to understand what are cybersecurity metrics, what makes an effective metric, and think about how that will play a role in our monitoring activities. From there, we'll look at two of the most common types of cybersecurity monitoring, and think about the similarities and differences between the two. So that'll be really a deeper dive on both network monitoring and what it means when we say continuous monitoring. And then lastly, we'll look at the new concept of a security operations center and think about how these play with existing monitoring technologies, and really look at some of the benefits of going with this monitoring approach. So to get started, we'll really take a deeper dive into cybersecurity metrics. It's typically helpful to go back and look at this from that same lifecycle perspective. And so in IEC 62443, we have three distinct phases, starting with the assessment phase, where we go through and conduct our risk assessments to see what are the most critical cybersecurity assets. From there, we move into the implementation phase and really start to think about how can we apply cybersecurity countermeasures, make sure that our design is sufficiently protected from cyber threats. And that'll go all the way through implementing and verifying that installed system. And then lastly, for the maintenance phase, something that, although it is where the facility will be for the vast majority of the time in the life cycle, we don't always focus on it enough. And I know I can be guilty sometimes of really diving in and looking specifically at the risk assessments for a lot of it. But we want to make sure that we're not forgetting that there's going to be that ongoing maintenance phase, and that really protecting the cybersecurity of the plant is something that has to be continually done every year, and sometimes even more frequently. So we'll look at really how effective monitoring plays a very critical role in that, and is one of the key steps for maintaining security throughout the entire life cycle. So if we go back to our title and think about kind of the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so this has roots, for a lot of different applications. It can be true of your time. It can be true of your network and your security as well. And so really the first step in having effective security monitoring is answering the question, what should be measured to evaluate the security performance? And so we want to think about establishing reliable criteria to define what we need to be measuring and using for our cybersecurity implementation. So we can really think of metrics as that ruler or those rankings so that we're able to really identify and measure our performance over time. If we think about why is measuring performance, something we want to do, it's important to stress that IEC 62443 is a performance-based standard. And so it's not going to prescribe a specific design for cybersecurity for the network. Instead, it outlines capabilities and strategies that should be used to really focus on protecting the network. And so with that, we need to actually be able to measure the effectiveness of those protections of our cybersecurity management system to accurately understand how successful we're being at applying cybersecurity. And so with that, defining those metrics or those key performance indicators really is going to be what provides the basis for our ongoing evaluation of our achieved security. If we think about, what makes a good metric or what, is a good candidate for this ongoing evaluation, there are a couple of different criteria we need to see. So first, it has to be specific to the application. So we can think about for control systems and cybersecurity specifically, there are a lot of different choices for metrics. Uh, Sometimes organizations really would want to focus in on the cleanliness of the control system. Are the cabinets maintained and are all of those steps taken rigorously? So while that may be very important for looking at the maintenance program and is certainly something that should be maintained, that may not be a specific metric to the overall cybersecurity of the network. Instead, we may want to look at the number of successful or failed intrusion attempts and use that to assess how frequently are we being targeted and how successful are our protections at repelling those attacks. The next thing that we can think about for our metrics is making them actionable. And so an example of how we might take a metric about policy violations and really move it to the next level would be to say if we have more than 5 policy violations in a set time frame, then we are going to initiate cybersecurity hygiene training more frequently. And so by defining them this way, it really makes sure that when we reach a certain threshold, that we're not just continuing to watch the situation get worse, but that we can actually take action and start to improve it and take steps to mitigate that. Another thing that we want to think about for our metrics are making them quantitative and tangible. And so while the goal of metrics are really to evaluate security and to improve the security posture over time, if we tried to make security posture by itself a metric and just said, we are tracking security posture, it's not something that's really quantitative or tangible. It's not specific enough for us to measure it accurately. If we were, however, going to measure, like I said before, intrusion attempts or things such as the number of vulnerabilities on the system, both of those we can define and consistently measure to see how they change over time. Another important aspect for metrics are making sure that they're objective and consistently measured. And so if we think back to our policy violations, that works as an effective method of tracking the metric because we have defined policies. And so it should be clear and non-biased to assess what a policy violation is. If we instead define that metric as unsafe or unsecure actions, it may be more difficult to define that, and depending on which personnel is responsible for tracking it, it may vary from site to site what's considered an unsecure act. And so really defining it in a clear and objective manner will support measuring that metric over time. The last thing that we want to think about is what can make our metrics relevant to industry standards and best practices. So for 62443, we really want to think about what are the key metrics for measuring our performance so we can evaluate or achieve security over time. The key takeaway from the metrics are that these metrics, these criteria that we're tracking, really are going to form the basis for ongoing cybersecurity monitoring and taking actions to improve cybersecurity on a continual basis. If we think about some of the types of information that needs to be measured in cybersecurity, there's quite a bit that we might want to track. One of the most common examples would be to think about the number of cybersecurity incidents. For these incidents, we could think about some of the data that we would want to capture along with them. So for a cybersecurity event, was it incidental or a deliberate attack? We might also want to track, was it resulting from an insider, or was it resulting from some sort of external threat? And so by tracking that, as well as tracking the metrics, we can start to build a better picture of the threat environment over time and really understand where our organization is most susceptible to attacks. Another example of information that needs to be measured for cybersecurity would be the network and network anomalies that we may see on that. So thinking about, unusually heavy traffic to one device or new network traffic patterns that are originating outside of the internal network may all be signs that something unusual is happening from a cybersecurity perspective, and it may be representative of an attack that needs a response. So thinking about how we define our network baseline and then monitor that over time can be another important cybersecurity metric. We also want to think about what we look at in terms of periodic vulnerability assessments and periodic risk reassessment as other places to really gather information. And during that, we can look at detailed device information, network information, as well as policy violations, and think about how is our overall approach for cybersecurity shifting over time? Are we staying up to date on all of our necessary activities? Some other things that we would look at for cybersecurity would be the level of training that's being conducted and our personal assessments or personal competency. How is that changing over time? Are we continually becoming more aware of cybersecurity threats, or are we potentially falling behind and losing some of that knowledge? We also would want to look at the frequency of patches and antivirus updates to think about what sort of things are we doing proactively to maintain a better cybersecurity posture. When we think about our different cybersecurity metrics, one useful way of grouping them is into either being leading indicators or lagging indicators. For leading indicators, these are going to be those warning signs that we can see before an incident occurs, whereas lagging indicators typically result from a cybersecurity incident or a near miss. If we think about some of the leading metrics, these could be things like deviations from our standard operation or from our cybersecurity management policies and procedures. It could also be deviations from our testing requirements. So if we're falling short of our required countermeasure testing, we're not doing adequate network scans to really keep an idea of where the network is, any deviations from the design intent of the network, or another one that we'll often talk about as a leading metric would be the number of known vulnerabilities in the system. All of those provide information that could tell us we may be more susceptible to a cyber attack. And we can see that before the attack actually occurs. And so it gives us an opportunity to try to implement mitigating actions before an incident has occurred. Things like lagging indicators can be useful because they really are very clear evidence, and they support information about whether or not the cybersecurity posture is where we want it to be. If we think about prevented attacks or attacks where our countermeasures are successful, this could be a lagging indicator because it really falls into that near miss criteria, but it tells us how attractive of a target we may be, and it also tells us where our cybersecurity countermeasures are working and where they're not. Successful attacks would be another example of a lagging indicator, but unfortunately in this case, we've already suffered the consequence event, but can you still use that to improve the system in the future and become better protected against that type of attack? So if we think about all of that and all of our considerations for metrics, at the end of the day, it really comes into how do we measure the health and integrity of our security protections as well as our system as a whole, to get that effective performance evaluation that's really called for in the 62443 standard. We'll talk about in monitoring, how by using these metrics, we can identify cyber attacks that require a response, um, as well as look for, potential vulnerabilities or weak points in our system. And the last thing that we want to mention is that for all of these metrics, when we're gathering information, um, they're certainly going to fit into that periodic reassessment or those periodic vulnerability assessments, because that really is what provides our knowledge about the operating environment, and we can use that to really get a better understanding of where the system is moving and really validate our assumptions that we made in the analysis and design phase. So keeping that performance evaluation is really a critical part of that periodic assessment. One thing that we do want to think about when we look at metrics is how they play a key role really in lifecycle integration between functional safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management. All three of those life cycles are really defined as performance-based standards. And so with that, we want to make sure that we are able to measure those key criteria to assess whether or not we are improving over time and really demonstrate that we are meeting the performance requirements of those standards. The benefit of integration here is that by looking at one system for recording metrics, we may be able to pull key information about the safety systems, alarm systems, and cybersecurity protections all in one place from our control network or our enterprise, our ICS as a whole. And so by having one place for really pulling that data and recording it by using that core data model, not only are we able to grab really significant insight about those different areas, but we also may be able to reduce the time and costs of deployment, as well as maintaining and managing those metrics over time. And so with that, we've got a background understanding of kind of how metrics play a role in measuring cybersecurity. Now we want to think about for cybersecurity monitoring, what does it mean to do network monitoring or continuous monitoring, and how are those related? In terms of requirements in the standard for network monitoring, um, the most clear requirement is defined in section 2-1 of the standard, which looks at more of the overall management philosophy for asset owners. And so in there are requirements for event and incident management, including event detection. And so the standard says that the asset owner shall ensure that IACS events are detectable to support security management activities that include reporting, logging, analysis, and response, whether immediate or delayed. And so this is another area where we can really see that 62443 is performance-based. It's not giving us a specific technology that we need to accomplish this, but there is a requirement that our system needs the capability to detect events. And so typically we'll see that this can be completed using network monitoring. When we think about network monitoring, there are really three fundamental principles of network monitoring and that make it an effective cybersecurity strategy. So the first foundation is that preventative cybersecurity measures are not 100% effective. And unfortunately, will never be 100% effective. The other way of saying this is that attackers will eventually breach the network. The second piece that makes network monitoring important is that although attackers will eventually be able to gain access to the network, they're not able to immediately deploy or implement their final objectives. That takes considerable time. And so for the third fundamental, if an organization is able to identify and contain an intrusion prior to that final objective, there's the opportunity to minimize the damage of the attack and actually protect the organization. And so if we think about that first point about preventative measures and why they're not 100% effective, sometimes there can be people who think, oh, we've got this novel design. Really, there's no way to overcome this. One example would be for the Triconics controllers. There was a physical switch in the Triton attacks that if it was in the run mode, it should have been impossible to configure the safety system. So that's an example of a protection that someone in a risk assessment will say, hey, it's in the run mode. There's no way that this can be overcome. But as we've seen, even those types of countermeasures can be defeated. And so in that specific case, there was a zero-day vulnerability that wasn't known, and it was actually used to compromise the controller and remotely make changes, even though it was in the run mode. So that's just one example of many that shows when existing security measures are deployed, hackers are continually working to break those. And even when the next step would be, all right, our current security measures aren't effective, we're going to develop and deploy a new security measure. Well, as soon as that step is taken, the hackers then look at how can we develop a means of breaking this new security measure. And so that cycle of continually improving the defense as well as the attacking tools is something that we've seen time and time again in cybersecurity. And really that cyclical pattern is going to continue indefinitely. And so what that means is there's never going to be that perfect protection. There is going to be some chance for the attackers to break through given enough time. For our kind of next basis of why network monitoring can be effective is that a cybersecurity attack is not an instantaneous hit and run type incident for the vast majority of attacks, particularly for industrial control systems. If we think about it, beginning after that initial compromise, whether it's a phishing campaign or any number of different attack vectors that could be used, there are a number of subsequent steps, including that initial logon, using that one compromised account to start to gain more information and passwords for other accounts. We can look at the reconnaissance activity that's required to really see what's happening on the network and to understand where to target and focus the attack. We can think about the actions necessary to prepare for the final objective. If it's some type of intellectual property and transfer of information type attack, a lot of times that will be copying the key information into a set file where there's one place to pull it off the network. If we think about for security issues, using the Triton attack as an example, once they had gotten onto the network, they first compromised the control system and then also went on to compromise the safety system before attempting to deploy the attack. And so there was considerable time that went into doing all of those steps to prepare for the final objective before they actually executed the code and attempted to cause the hazardous scenario. And so while this time can vary depending on the type of attack, it's certainly not seconds. Maybe for some simpler attacks, it could be hours. But for the vast majority of control system attacks, we're talking about days, weeks, and months before the attacks are fully executed. If we think about how long it takes organizations sometimes to identify and respond to cybersecurity issues, I saw a statistic the other day that the average time was 240 days for an organization after it was initially compromised before they even realized the breach. So almost an entire year is passing before organizations are really seeing that they've been compromised. And that gives the attackers a very long time to play with. If we think back to Stuxnet, really one of the earliest examples of cybersecurity attacks on industrial control systems, that attack went unnoticed for almost 2 entire years, continuing to cause equipment damage and slow down the progress of the uranium enrichment facility. And so if we think about it, the sooner we're able to detect those attacks, we'll be much more successful at either limiting the harm from the attack if it's already been implemented or preventing that harmful scenario from even occurring. And so if we think about that, then the primary goal of network monitoring is to identify those cybersecurity incidents that need response, whether it's detecting anomalies in the network activity through traffic patterns or increased traffic. So really by identifying those incidents, we have the opportunity to respond and prevent the consequences. A secondary goal of some network monitoring is to keep an up-to-date asset inventory so we can kind of see what's connected to the network, where the traffic is going, but it's really secondary to identifying and responding to those cyber threats. If we think about the types of monitoring that we can use on a control network, there are kind of two main ones that we'll look at. The first is passive monitoring. And so this works by capturing and analyzing live network traffic, or essentially traffic that is already running on the network. And so in passive monitoring, no additional network traffic is added, so there's no risk of disrupting any critical processes. Um, the drawback of passive monitoring is that it can take more time to analyze the entire network because it needs to wait for traffic to be generated from each device. But passive monitoring can be run 24/7, and then the logs of this can be evaluated either manually or using an automated tool at a set frequency. For active monitoring, in contrast to passive monitoring, we're actually developing and sending test traffic into the network. And so this can be very effective for gathering basic profile information because we're able to send it to all of the devices and get faster results because we'll see responses coming back from those devices. Now, because active monitoring is sending new traffic onto the network, there is a higher potential for network disruption, particularly in older legacy ICS systems that may not know how to respond to the request for information. So there can potentially be some risks associated with active monitoring. What we're seeing more and more are solutions employing a mixture of both active and passive monitoring to try to improve the detail of the information while limiting the potential for disruption. So typically, it's not always going to be a choice of either or for some of these security techniques, but actually thinking about how both of them can be used can be very effective for getting the best results. If we think about, regardless of the type of network scanning that we're doing, we really want to establish a network baseline because that's how we'll have a better chance of detecting anomalies or seeing unusual activity. And so whichever type of monitoring tool we use, we really can establish that network baseline and use that over time. And so then for our periodic monitoring, we'll compare our results to our baseline and see, what types of changes have occurred. Are they, benign in nature? Do we know that we've made some updates to the network? Are they suspicious? Do we need to investigate more to try to understand, is this a potential attack? Or is it clearly malicious, and is it something that we can take immediate action on? So really by having that network baseline, it gives us the flexibility. It kind of gives us that metric to evaluate against and see what the current network is doing. If we think about the time frame for monitoring, it can vary significantly. Some organizations are moving forward to online continuous measurements, where you think about some sort of 24/7 monitoring activity. Typically, for something that's deployed this way, it would be passive monitoring, so just looking at the traffic on the network. Batch online measurements are an option. Sometimes this can provide some more detail, and maybe you would use some active scanning here. There's also the opportunity to do offline periodic inspection and test. So thinking about this as part of our periodic reassessment or vulnerability audits, if the system's offline, we may actually be able to perform more invasive, more comprehensive testing. Now, the one thing we will note is the term continuous monitoring can actually be used and is commonly used in security for anything that is measured at least monthly. And so even if we hear the term that continuous monitoring is being done, we always have to be cautious and kind of talk through and understand what the specific monitoring time frame for that system is, because there is a pretty wide range, everything from that 24/7 continuous monitoring to more of a weekly or monthly type check. If we think about for this continuous monitoring, are there specific requirements in the standard? What we can see in a separate part of 62443 in section 3-3 that really looks at the overall system requirements. There are a foundational requirement for timely response to events, and one of the requirements for that is this continuous monitoring. And so it reads that the control system shall provide the capability to continuously monitor all security mechanism performance using commonly accepted security industry practices and recommendations to detect, characterize, and report security breaches in a timely manner. And so this is a required capability for security levels 2, 3, and 4. So essentially any system that's higher than security level 1. And so we can think about, with this requirement, what really are we trying to achieve with our continuous monitoring? And so the primary goal is to improve visibility of cybersecurity vulnerabilities, as well as our cybersecurity protections. And so really we're looking to verify that our protections are still in place. And if we have known vulnerabilities, thinking about, do we need to mitigate them? And so this can help with keeping an up-to-date asset inventory because we'll be continually checking all of the devices, and we can look at everything for, do those assets have known vulnerabilities or insecure configurations. A secondary goal of continuous monitoring is that by having this increased visibility, it could also provide indication of cybersecurity threats. We could look at, are we seeing unapproved changes or modifications? And that can sometimes be a clue that will lead us to identifying a cybersecurity attack. So the question that I'm most often asked when we think about these two different types of monitoring is, does continuous monitoring fully replace network monitoring? Are they interchangeable? Really, how are they related? And so if we think about it, continuous monitoring is really vulnerability focused. We're keeping that up-to-date asset inventory and we are identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities or holes in our security protections and trying to fix them as proactively as possible. Whereas for network monitoring, it's much more threat focused. We're specifically detecting and responding to cybersecurity incidents or attackers who are gaining access to the system. And so because of that, they actually typically have very separate goals and very different means of being carried out. And so for organizations that are truly serious and really are looking to have effective cybersecurity monitoring, they typically deploy a combination of network monitoring and continuous monitoring techniques. One way that we are seeing organizations start to really adopt and implement this type of monitoring is to look at security operations centers. And so security operations centers, sometimes abbreviated to SOCs or SOCs, really are a growing trend in cybersecurity monitoring. Essentially what they are is a central unit that's responsible for detecting and responding to cybersecurity threats. They'll often combine elements of both network monitoring and continuous monitoring to improve really the real-time visibility of the network and its vulnerabilities, as well as the responsiveness to potential cybersecurity threats. If we think about the elements that make up an OT Security Operations Center, we'll talk about a number of key pieces. The first will be firewalls or our boundary protections with intrusion prevention or detection systems. These are one example of cybersecurity alerts and alarms, but there are also many others that can be deployed on the network. We'll also think about what are really our capabilities for monitoring and looking at the network traffic at different points. We'll think about security information and event management, and so how the logs generated from our devices can be used. Lastly, we'll think about procedures for detecting and analyzing security breaches. And then lastly, what are the procedures for actually responding to those security breaches when they occur? For intrusion detection systems, if we think about it, the firewall is very similar to the lock on the door of our network. And the intrusion detection system is the burglar alarm. It will detect when someone is trying to break in or bypass the firewall. And so if we think back to our monitoring fundamentals, the firewall is a preventive measure that, while extremely helpful and critical for the protection of the network, will not be 100% effective. And so the burglar alarm, or the IDS in this case, is what is really going to alert us that the security capability has broken down and give us an opportunity to respond to and mitigate the intrusion. For intrusion prevention systems, these work similar to an IDS, but they also have the ability to automatically block the suspected malicious activity. Now, for IDS, we do see a couple of common issues, including they can have many false positives. Sometimes, depending on where they're deployed in the system, it can be a significant cost. Um, the intrusion detection system also is not, going to be a replacement for the SOC team because it's only effective against known vulnerabilities. So it has some things that it knows to look for, but it may not be able to identify all types of attack. And then lastly, for control system protocols, there aren't as many readily available signatures for the intrusion detection systems. If we think about some of the best practices for IDS, typically we will deploy at the entry and exit points of each of our security zones. And that way we'll be able to get the best visibility of where the communication is occurring with each of the devices. We also have some resources for improving the typical IT signatures with SCADA and ICS specific signatures. We can also think about for our intrusion protection system, prevention systems, because they have so many false positives, we really want to be careful about what traffic we're automatically blocking because it does have the potential to interfere with desired operations. Um, and then lastly, we want to follow good alarm management principles. And so we can pull these kind of from our integrated lifecycle approach from our understanding of alarm rationalization in general. But some key takeaways would be that an effective cybersecurity alert and alarm requires an action either from IT or OT personnel or the operator to prevent or respond to a potentially dangerous or unsecure situation. Uh, and the goal here, again, with our network monitoring is to address the potential security concern before it becomes a major incident. And so types of cybersecurity alarms include the intrusion detection system that we talked about. We can also look at physical access control. So has a secure perimeter for a site been breached? Um, a lot of advanced IO networks have alerts for loss of communication when the devices are no longer able to speak to each other. Some typical controller alarms would be a cyclic redundancy check. So thinking about has anything been modified on the logic solver since the last configuration was downloaded. One type of alarm that could be used for an engineering workstation would be an alarm if a file sharing application is used, and that could help alert due to some sort of intellectual property or data theft type attack. If we think about, what are some characteristics of a good alarm, it's got to be relevant. So make sure that it's not spurious or of low operational value to the team reviewing it. We want to make sure each, alarm is unique so that we're not, flooding ourselves with alarms every time a potential incident occurs. It should be timely. So something that is going to require action, but that the alarm gives us enough time to actually take an action before the consequence occurs. We also want to think about them being prioritized because not all cybersecurity alarms will have the same criticality. An intrusion detection system, may be something that's very important to investigate and see if an attack is in progress. But if our cyclic redundancy check all of a sudden shows that our SIS has been changed and no one has made the update, so it's clear that someone has gained access to it, that is going to have a higher criticality and require a more immediate response. So it should have a higher priority. We also want to think about making sure that the alarms are understandable so that they've got an associated message that can be used to respond to it. This is something that really will fit hand in hand with our response procedures for the SOC. Another element is looking at the monitoring activity and kind of the continuous monitoring of the devices and all of the network devices on the system. So servers, routers, switches, firewalls, they can all create, thousands to tens of thousands of log entries every single day. And so while that can be a lot of information and take a long time to go through and sort manually, security information and event management, or SIEM systems, use programmed intelligence to identify those patterns out of what might seem to us to be random events. And so that can really help with taking this improved monitoring and turning it into actionable metrics as well as actionable responses to potential security concerns. And so when we think about the SOC procedures, we really want to think about the competency of the SOC personnel because this is going to be critical. Thinking about their experience with OT technology and applications will be critical to how they interpret and respond to the information. We want to think about their training for both the analysis of cybersecurity events as well as the defined response procedures. We also want to define the communication with stakeholders so that they know who to reach out to at the local site when an incident may be occurring. And so by working with this, by including our network baseline and our parameters for cybersecurity and for deviations, we can really have clear definition of our cyber alerts and alarms and have defined very detailed steps for reviewing the system logs. And so additionally for our SOC procedures, we want to make sure that we consider both the immediate response and our secondary response for business continuity and disaster recovery. And so actually next month, our webinar will really be focusing in on and looking at the response piece of trying to prevent cybersecurity events. Some other trends that we are seeing more and more, especially related to the monitoring, are further integration of IT and OT cybersecurity. So we're starting to see an increase in the corporate involvement in OT cybersecurity, typically in the role of a CISO or really a C-level security executive that has responsibility not just for the enterprise IT networks, but also for the OT networks. Another place where we're seeing this is that many organizations are leveraging their existing IT SOC and using that to combine it with the OT response team. And so some benefits of that are that it really decreases the development time and cost because that infrastructure is already in place and there are already set personnel who have experience responding to those events. If you do go with this integrated approach, two of the things that we do kind of recommend looking at are, is there a secure means of relaying the data from the control system to the central or combined SOC? Because you really want to make sure that that data is retrieved securely and protected while it's in transit. We also want to make sure that we're considering how the responses for an incident on the OT side may vary from the IT side and make sure that the overall team is trained on how to respond to both types of incidents. If we think about deploying this approach or really deploying any combination of network and security monitoring, there are a number of significant benefits that we can achieve. The first is that we're going to improve our monitoring of system vulnerabilities. We'll have a better cybersecurity posture and really more visibility into what our current posture is. We can also improve our response to cybersecurity incidents and minimize the consequence even after an intrusion has occurred. We can also think about from a metric standpoint, by monitoring those metrics, we're going to get improved insight into the level of cybersecurity that our organization, that our facility is achieving over time, and be able to make more informed decisions. Because really when we talk about continuous improvement for cybersecurity, we want it to be data-driven. We want to have the metrics and the facts to base, really to support what decisions we're making in terms of what cybersecurity countermeasures are most important, what we're focusing our cybersecurity training on, and really make sure that we are continuing to steer to that better cybersecurity posture. So in summary, what we looked at today was really starting off with our cybersecurity metrics, trying to understand what some examples are and what important criteria for them would be. From there, we compared and contrasted network and continuous monitoring to understand the roles that they both play in cybersecurity monitoring. And then lastly, we looked at the security operations centers as a new trend and something that is really emerging for cybersecurity monitoring. So as we go through these last couple slides, if you do have any questions that you didn't ask throughout the presentation, I did see some come in, but this is now a good time to jot those down. Just to really some information as we continue to go through this challenging time. Exida is really staying committed to meeting all of our customers' safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management needs. And we've seen a lot of different changes for all of our different groups, including our improved remote meeting capability. We've developed a fully remote certification audit process. We've also got some new enhanced training options, including our live streaming room that I've had the opportunity to use for a couple of classes and have really enjoyed using. And we've also moved our personnel certifications for safety and cybersecurity to fully online formats. Some of our upcoming training courses are again taking advantage of that live streaming room, and we've got a good mix of safety and cybersecurity courses coming up. One thing, if you are looking for a course and you don't see any times that work for you, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know what you're interested in taking, and we can certainly look to schedule and put some more of those on the calendar. In addition to our live streaming room, we do also are continuing to really increase the number of online self-paced trainings that we have. And so we now offer a lot of our different classes online. If the content from this webinar, if you found it interesting, really the CS 102 gives us that full life cycle approach, and I'm the instructor for that recorded course, so certainly it's a good way to learn a little bit more information about it. Lastly, if you are interested in getting updates on other upcoming webinars, don't hesitate to follow exida on social media. And then lastly, if you do have any questions that you don't get a chance to ask today, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm always happy to get them, and we'll respond typically in a pretty fast manner. So let's look at what we've had come in so far. So the first question is, how does the type of facility or the location affect what the desired or optimal monitoring time frame would be? And so if we think about it, even for continuous monitoring, because it can have such a wide range, if we think about being either monthly or as frequently as actually 24/7 continuous, it really does depend. The site size and location are certainly part of it, but I would typically focus mostly on a risk-based approach and think about for the risks to my facility because of the potential hazards that exist. I really want to use that to drive how frequently I'm monitoring and what sort of protections I'm putting in place. So really, the higher the risk basis, typically the more frequent and more robust the monitoring capabilities should be. All right, so another question here is asking about, for the key performance indicators. So, we talked about how they relate to IEC 62443, but the question here is, do KPIs specifically translate to a given security level or to a maturity level? So if we think about our cybersecurity management, this is what we're really looking at, a maturity assessment, and understanding that we need to have defined policies and procedures that are executed by competent and trained personnel. And so for that perspective, the monitoring of those metrics really directly correlates to the jump from a maturity level 3 to maturity level 4, or a jump from practice to continuous improvement, and really making the transition to the highest maturity level for cybersecurity protections. So it's certainly, the KPIs are a very big part of improving the maturity. As far as the security level, the most direct correlation would be to look at the system requirements, and that the continuous monitoring of those KPIs or of the network conditions is something that's required for security levels 2 to 4. So that would be the closest correlation to the security lifecycle. And then our last question here is for the logic solvers, what would be an example of a KPI? So the things that we could think about, tracking for our controllers would be the number of vulnerabilities at a given time, the frequency of patches that are deployed by the manufacturer. We could also look at the frequency of modification. How frequently are we updating those settings? We could even, track any sort of, temporary losses in network connectivity or any alerts for random failures. So there's a lot of things that we might want to track over time for logic solvers. Okay, so that looks to be the last question that we have. So again, if you do have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and thank you very much for joining us on our webinar today. I look forward to the follow-on next month to look at the emergency response plans and how, once we detect cybersecurity incidents, what can we do to really minimize the consequence. So thank you for joining, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoons.